broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Sharon Hewson from AEE. Welcome to our member webinar this afternoon. We have 3 speakers for you today. We have Miss Catherine Luthin, Miss Leah Cairone, and Miss Victoria Simon. I will just take a moment to introduce those in just a moment. But first of all, please be aware that if you are listening in today, you will receive a follow-up email from GoToWebinar in the next few days. That will contain a link to today's recording and to your certificate of attendance. If you have questions throughout the presentation today, please go ahead and post your questions in the questions section. If you look on your GoToWebinar control panel, you'll see a gray bar that says questions. In there, you can go ahead and type your questions and send, and then we will address those as appropriate throughout the webinar, but most will be addressed at the end. If you have technical questions or need technical support from me during the webinar, could you please go ahead and post those in the chat section? Also, you can find this on your GoToWebinar control panel. If you look towards the bottom, you have a chat option right there. In addition to this, you will see in the handouts section on the control panel, there are 4 handouts on there for you today. There is one from each of our 3 presenters, plus a newsletter from Luthin Associates. So we will bring your attention to those throughout the webinar today. So let me go ahead and introduce our speakers. Our subject today is energy policy innovation and its impact on carbon reduction. And hosting, after I have done my introductions, will be Ms. Catherine Luthin. Ms. Luthin has over 30 years of financial and energy management experience within the corporate, the non-profit, and regulatory environments. Catherine is president of Luthin Associates, which was founded in 1994. Luthin Associates is an energy management consulting firm that proactively manages energy procurement and sustainability services for their clients. They accomplish this by delivering cost savings based upon innovative thinking and process improvements for the education, healthcare, and real estate industries. To date, Luthin Associates has saved over $395 million for their clients. Catherine also chairs and manages Consumer Power Advocates, CPA. This is an association of large non-profit institutions whose primary goal is to decrease the cost of energy by focusing on regulatory decisions and programs which impact energy consumers in New York State. In addition to this, Catherine has also participated in a variety of other energy initiatives and organizations, including formerly serving on Mayor Bloomberg's New York City energy policy. Formerly serving on Mayor Bloomberg's New York City Energy Policy Task Force and co-authoring the Distribution Generation DG section of Plan New York City. Catherine is currently a member of BOMA's New York's Energy Committee, a member of the AEE CEP Board, which is the Certified Energy Procurement Board. Catherine was formerly the Energy Policy Chairperson for the AEE Council on Women in Energy and Environmental Leadership, also known as CWIL, and she has also participated in New York Mayor's Office Energy Supply Focus Group to assist with the 80 by 50 Action Plan goals. In addition to these, there are some other accomplishments of Catherine's. She was named Energy Service Professional of the Year for the state of New York in 2002. In 2004, she was named International Energy Service Professional of the Year by AEE. Catherine has also been chosen by the leading women entrepreneurs and business owners as a top 25 leading woman entrepreneur of New Jersey for 2015. In addition, Luthin Associates has been honored as one of the top 100 diversity businesses in New Jersey and has been awarded an outstanding MWBE by Ankin in 2012 and received Ankin's Outstanding Advocacy Award in 2013. Catherine has also been a guest lecturer at CUNY's Institute for Urban Systems, Cornell University, and Columbia University's Environmental and Energy Policy Department. Catherine is a results-focused and effectual leader with proven ability to develop and implement energy management initiatives within major New York institutions. Catherine has an MBA and a bachelor's degree in marketing from Farley Dickinson University. Another of our presenters today, Victoria Simon. Victoria is a policy consultant and the producer of the podcast Political Climate. Political Climate is a bipartisan show on energy and environmental issues in America. Victoria's consulting work focuses on sustainability issues, and she has recently helped launch Los Angeles' sustainability plan called LA's Green New Deal. Victoria's public policy work started in New York as a special assistant to the chairman of the New York State Public Service Commission. She then became the vice president for energy and telecommunications at the New York City Economic Development Corporation, where she helped to create New York City's first sustainability plan under Mayor Bloomberg. Victoria has eventually moved to California to work for the chairman and president of Edison International. This is the parent company to Southern California Edison and Edison Energy. Our next presenter today is Leah Cairone. Leah serves as the Assistant Deputy Director for Policy with the New York City Mayor's Office of Sustainability, where she is responsible for developing and advancing green building policies to further New York City's climate objectives. Recently, Leah spearheaded the development and passage of Local Law 97, which requires large buildings to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Leah was the chief architect of the 1.5 degrees C aligning New York City with Paris Climate Agreement. This is Climate Action Plan and supported the development of New York City's 80 by 50 roadmap. Leah previously served as the New York City advisor to C40 and has worked in the private sector in technology, marketing, film, and media. Leah is an advocate for sustainable development, climate action, and social equality. Leah received her Master of International Affairs from Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs in Climate and Energy Policy, and her Bachelor of Science from New York University's Leonard N. Stern School of Business. So thank you to all three of you for being here today. I am going to pass over to Ms. Catherine Luthin.
Thank you. Thank you. I think you all learned way too much about me. So the reason why I thought of this topic, and it's going to be a series that AEE has been blessed to give me, is that how to reduce carbon is really the challenge that all of us have. And as I put together this panel, the most important thing when you're presenting in front of a bunch of people is really know your audience. And for the ladies and gentlemen that are listening to me, you all have a scientific bent. So basically the focus is it's greenhouse gas emissions. I started the business more than 25 years ago. And during that period of time, the science of climate change was really beginning. You had a bunch of models that were developed at the turn of the 21st century, and we take a look at them, and they've generally been correct. The last 2 decades in the century, the predictions of extreme weather, sea level rise, droughts, and forest fires have all come true. So, in my opinion, the clear connection between predictions of the past decade and reality has been established. There's also co-benefits to reducing carbon. Personally, I suffer from asthma. I'm aware that the greenhouse gas emissions contribute significantly to pollution in the air, and it affects health. And if we build and create enough renewables in a reasonable, rational fashion, I believe that in time we're going to be able to reduce future energy costs. So this is why the focus. Why East Coast, West Coast? Bottom line, there's always been a little bit of a rivalry between the two. You know, sometimes it's California's first, sometimes New York is first, but both states, California and New York, have very active citizens and deep commitment to the environment. And there's the feeling that Fed inaction that which has been in place recently, you need to spur change. And the states, they're not waiting around for the federal government. So both New York and California are viewed as global leaders. The California policy and legislation, so basically, you know, how did we get here, and how, you know, both women on the panel are going to talk about what's happening right now. But in California, when I started working in this field, the things that I noticed were that there was a climate registry. There was a law created, you know, it's like it created the registry, recorded the early greenhouse gas emissions, it set reduction goals and standards for M&D measurement. And again, go back to the audience that we have, which is the engineers and the scientists and the people that really care about climate change and being able to reduce energy and to do it in an efficient manner. This really was a great way to start measuring what we've been doing for years. So there was the automobile emission standards, and in California, the greenhouse gas emissions for cars became very strict. They're still extremely strict. There is federal, you know, push to overturn that. But it wasn't just the cars. It was the range of performance standards for appliances, equipment, and now buildings that really do make a difference. And renewable energy, 2002, California passed one of the nation's first renewable energy standards, and last year that target went all the way to you know, quite a bit of, sorry, yeah, sorry, I can't read this. It's okay, sorry. And then they also put energy storage requirements in, which was a 2010 law, requiring electric utilities to install minimum levels of grid-scale energy storage infrastructure. So the target now in California is 100% by 2045, which is, it's challenging. It's a big goal. What Victoria's going to talk about is that in Los Angeles, they developed a Green New Deal plan, and that's significant. I mean, LA really has a problem with pollution, and it's one of the cities in California that needs a target with that. So New York, where I spend most of my time, you know, we really looked at Plan New York City, which is really the period of time I met Victoria, who was in New York City and then moved to California. So she actually was one of the people working on Plan New York City with me. And it was the first real plan where everything was put together, where we looked at infrastructure, we looked at DG, we really committed to a goal for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And, you know, the first one came out in 2007. It was updated significantly. It was a moving target, you know, more and more different parts of what needed to be dealt with, including not just reliability, but making sure that we could survive another superstorm. Sandy became part of the way we were looking at the infrastructure in New York City. Bill de Blasio continued with One New York City. And that's, really what we're using to manage climate change. And that's something that's updated constantly. What Leah is going to talk about is the Client Mobilization Act, which is Local Law 97. And that's going to place buildings on a path to meet the New York City goal to reduce overall carbon emissions by 80% by 2050. And then the state of New York just recently passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. If you grab these handouts, all of them actually have hyperlinks that can take you specifically to the legislation. And one of the things that you might want to grab too is the newsletter, which is LA Confidential, and there's a whole article on the Climate Mobilization Act. So, why am we talking about this for AEE members? It's because you guys are the forefront of being able to affect the change. The nerds rule right now, okay? And, I've been in this business a real long time. In the past, the business case to pursue energy efficiency and make capital investments really had competing interests. You walk into a hospital and you propose an energy conservation measure that is a slam dunk. But honestly, they want to buy an MRI machine. And the MRI machine is going to win out. But the current changes in legislation alter that dynamic. It makes energy efficiency a priority, and it shifts those interests. And I want you guys to pay attention to this because there's a significant business opportunity for AEE members. And I'm going to hand this right back to Sharon now.
Okay, thank you. Next to present will be Victoria Simon. So, Victoria, if you are ready, I'm actually going to hand over to you. Victoria, you're currently muted.
Sorry about that. I'm just gonna bring this up all the way. All right, so getting to zero. Before I get into the nitty-gritty of the policies, I just wanted to step back to provide a little perspective on where LA comes from when it comes to the environment. Starting in the early 1940s, people in the city, they began seeing this yellow haze descend over LA. And there were a lot of causes, but the primary one was cars. You combine being the car capital of the country with the busiest ports, mountains that ring the city, trapping pollution, and a lot of sunny, hot days, which exacerbate smog, you're faced with quite a challenge. So LA created the nation's first air quality regulator, along with a host of regulations, and we've seen a lot of improvement. But the reality is that LA still has the worst smog in the country. So yes, LA is a bunch of lefty hippies, but it's also motivated by something very real and tangible, and that's the air we breathe. For a lot of cities, the environment and climate change can feel more amorphous, but in LA, the results of our car culture are right outside the door. You couple that with droughts and wildfires, and you both have a lot of work to do and also the motivation to address it. And I'd also be remiss if I didn't also address the theme of the webinar, East Coast versus West Coast, as a motivating factor. As Catherine alluded to, rivalry can be helpful. So since sustainability first became a more mainstream concept, New York City and California have developed a friendly rivalry, keeping tabs on the other's goals, proposals, and strategies. I remember working on New York City's first sustainability plan in 2007 and hearing what Governor Schwarzenegger was up to, and we just could not let this Republican action star beat us. There's a similar dynamic this year in pulling together LA's Green New Deal, Mayor Garcetti's sustainability plan, which I'll get to shortly. This friendly competition is really motivating and helps set the tone for what you see across the country. So while we're talking about two mega cities today, the goals and legislation proposed in New York City and LA are ones that can be applied across the country and potentially at the federal level as well. I just wanted to give you a brief overview of some of the significant climate action at the state level here. I know Catherine talked about it a bit, but California has long been a leader in environmental regulations. And for example, California pushed for and received a waiver back in the 1970s to adopt more stringent emission standards for vehicles. And these stronger standards then were adopted by 12 other states, and even Canada just announced that it would hold itself to the California standard rather than the US one. These regulations are currently being challenged by the Trump administration, but they still serve as the backbone for encouraging cleaner vehicle purchases and reducing greenhouse gases in the transportation sector. You can see this in full effect when it comes to electric vehicles. So 53% of all EV sales in the US are in California. And Governor Brown has set an even more ambitious agenda for the state by putting into place an executive order that targets 5 million zero emissions vehicles on the road by 2030. This is backed by $2.5 billion in funding to modernize and expand the EV charging infrastructure. Another example of California's leadership is AB 32, which was passed in 2006. It was the first program in the country to take a comprehensive long-term approach to addressing climate change. And since then, we've seen 23 states follow suit. It was updated in 2016, and by law, California must reduce greenhouse gas emissions 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. Before leaving office, Governor Brown signed an executive order putting California's economy on track to be carbon neutral by 2045, which Catherine mentioned. This means not just eliminating greenhouse gases from the electricity sector, but zeroing them out across the entire economy, including manufacturing, transportation, and industry. It was pretty incredible until New York State stepped in and approved a binding and enforceable law to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Both are pretty great, but a round of applause to New York on that one. California also put in place the first in the nation state-mandated green building code that applies to non-residential structures. In 2015, as part of the state's renewable portfolio standard, a goal was set to double building energy efficiency by 2030. The Property Assessment Clean Energy Program, or PACE, is key to that effort, and thus far over $2 billion in transactions on residential buildings have occurred. So you have a significant history and foundation at the state level on climate action, but it actually did take a little longer for Los Angeles to join the party. LA didn't come out with its own sustainability plan until 2015 under the leadership of Mayor Garcetti. That's 8 years after New York City. Since that time, the plan has been updated every year, and this past April got a major overhaul. LA's Green New Deal sets bolder, more ambitious targets, with the bottom line being zero. By 2050, LA will have a zero carbon grid, zero carbon buildings, zero carbon transportation, zero waste, and zero wasted water, or at least that's the plan. So what does LA's Green New Deal mean in practical terms? Laying the foundation for much of the bold targets LA put forth is the electrical grid. As I'll detail, the vision is for both buildings and transportation sector, which combined make up the majority of the greenhouse gases in the city, to transition from being powered by fossil fuels to being all electric. Now, this can only be tallied as a greenhouse gas reduction when if the electricity used is zero carbon. One major advantage LA has is its control of its utility, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, or LADWP. This allows the mayor and city council to align sustainability goals with utility action. LA's Green New Deal calls for 55% renewable power by 2025, 80% by 2036, and 100% by 2045. Now, running in tandem with this goal is the closure of 3 natural gas plants by 2029. These plants represent 38% of the city's current natural gas portfolio and will have to be replaced with renewable generation. In his announcement, the mayor admitted that the replacement details and associated costs have not yet been worked out, and LADWP would need to shift its focus from its strategic long-term resource plan to a 100% renewable study. Specific renewable targets were set and coupled with a $1 billion investment over the next 5 years to achieve it. On solar, LA is currently the #1 solar city in America, which isn't surprising given the weather and supportive programs that have been in place for years. Actually, just a couple of weeks ago, LADWP presented a potentially world record-setting solar plus storage proposal that would be the cheapest in the world to date. It's 200 megawatts of solar plus 100 megawatt hours of storage. And there are 2 more proposals on the way. You can see a picture of something similar actually in the Mojave Desert, where you have solar coupled with energy storage. On the building side, the feed-in tariffs are also high on the agenda. LA has the largest in the nation feed-in tariff solar program, which targets commercial, industrial, and residential buildings. This pilot resulted in 150 megawatts of solar, 500 million in economic activity, and displaced about 70,000 metric tons of greenhouse gases each year. According to the UCLA Luthin Center of Innovation, there's still 10,000 acres of underutilized rooftops of office buildings, warehouses, and apartment buildings in LA. So the push is now on expanding this program along with online permitting to help accelerate LADWP to hit that nearly 2,000 megawatt goal. Residential demand response programs are also critical, and so efforts to roll out an expanded net metering program will soon begin. Buildings make up the majority of carbon pollution in LA, and that's why LA's Green New Deal calls for the steepest near-term reductions in greenhouse gases to come from this sector. In 2017, the existing Buildings Energy and Water Efficiency Ordinance, which is called AEE here, went into effect. This makes public the energy and water use of all existing buildings over 20,000 square feet and city-owned buildings over 7,500 square feet. The first phase requires benchmarking, and the second phase, starting in 2020, requires audits and retro commissioning reports. These reports have to be updated every 5 years, and it's expected that the ordinance will reduce city greenhouse gases by 10% by 2025 and energy consumption by 7%. So this AEE ordinance laid the groundwork for efficiency improvements, but it doesn't get LA's buildings to zero. That's a whole other lift. So the city is putting a lot of stock in the idea of electrifying new and existing buildings. As California's utilities increasingly provide cleaner electricity to consumers, buildings become a growing barrier and also an opportunity to achieve the greenhouse gas reduction targets. In recognizing this fact, the state and city have begun moving towards building electrification, and in February of 2018, the LA City Council adopted an amendment requiring the city buildings department and utility to make specific recommendations to reduce building demand for natural gas and shift gas use to clean, pollution-free electricity. And they also established aggressive 2028 and 2038 building electrification targets that meet or exceed the sustainability goals. So that's something that the buildings department is beginning to put together now. It wasn't long after this amendment came through that Sacramento also passed a law requiring the California Energy Commission to assess the potential for the state to reduce carbon pollution from residential and commercial buildings by 40% from 1990 levels by 2030. And a complementary bill was also passed, which lays the groundwork for building decarbonization by spurring development of the market for clean heating technologies. $50 million annually of cap and trade funds will be allocated to 2 programs that are going to be looking at building this market. So the clear signal is that buildings are at the top of the agenda, both within LA and at the state level. These changes are coming, whether it be with the carrot or the stick, and building owners and engineers will be wise to get ahead of the curve with building efficiency, weighing in on the policy development and taking advantage of some of the incentives and funding streams that are coming. Specific legislation to achieve zero carbon buildings by 2050 has not been proposed in LA, but policymakers are paying very close attention to what's happening in New York with setting specific greenhouse gas targets for buildings, much like they require already efficiency improvements under that AEE ordinance I discussed. So I would suggest that it's just a matter of time before LA follows what New York is doing with those greenhouse gas building specific targets. On transportation, as I mentioned, LA is known as the car capital of the world, and the ramifications of that have been significant. 19% of the greenhouse gas emissions in LA come from vehicles, and cars are a top contributor to air pollution. The mayor is trying to turn this negative attribute into a positive by electrifying millions of the vehicles on the road. And in his view, LA could be the transportation technology capital of the world and slough off this current car city moniker. So this sounds very exciting, but how do we get there? First, LA is investing more in transit infrastructure than any other American city in history. Since 2015, 1,800 publicly available electric vehicle charging stations have been installed, and the plan is to install 10,000 more in the next 5 years and 28,000 more by 2028. The nation's largest EV car sharing program for underserved communities was launched, called Blue LA Electric Car Sharing Program. And LA's Green New Deal sets a target of distributing 1,000 used EV rebates along with a suite of other rebates encouraging EV purchasing. In addition, the city is committed to converting all city fleet vehicles to zero emissions. And taking that leadership a step further, the mayor brought together 127 cities and 15 counties to leverage their buying power and commit to purchasing over 2,000 EVs by the end of 2020 for their own municipal fleets. So the hope is that this would send a signal to automakers that demand is high across the country. The mayor also signed a fossil fuel-free streets declaration with the mayor of Long Beach pledging to purchase only zero emissions buses by 2025 and designating a major area of LA to be zero emissions by 2030. So there's recognition that permitting needs to be streamlined, building codes updated, and the curb needs to be reassessed. Something that's been getting more attention is the value of the curb. We use it for street parking, ride sharing, electric scooters and bikes, bus stops and EV chargers. But how do we prioritize this public space for the public good? It's something that any overhaul of the transportation system is going to need to examine closely. Now, transportation needs to be about more than just switching one polluting car out for a clean one, though. Angelenos drive 60 million miles per day, and the goal is to cut this by 45% by 2050. So that's a big and ambitious objective, and it did receive a major boost in 2016 by the voter-approved Measure M, which commits $120 billion over 40 years to expand rail, rapid bus, and bike networks. The plan is to build 28 major transportation projects by 2028. Unfortunately, sometimes that field of dreams adage, if you build it, they will come, doesn't exactly work out, and ridership on public transportation is actually down despite 2 new rail lines being built. So while there's a great deal of money and effort being put into the public transportation system, LA's Green New Deal plan does recognize that behavioral changes are necessary too. One success story tied to this comes from the private sector. E-scooters were first introduced by a company called Bird in the city of Santa Monica, and the concept has really taken off. There's literally tens of thousands of them on the streets and sidewalks, which has admittedly caused a lot of chaos, but has also proven to be a really great alternative to driving or taking an Uber. Actually, even Uber and Lyft have developed their own e-scooters. It's inexpensive, easy to use, and probably the biggest factor of all, just very fun. The city is now managing the largest stockless vehicle fleet in the country with over 1 million rides each month. Street safety is a priority, and even improving the look and feel and comfort of transit centers is part of the LA's Green New Deal. And finally, LA is tiptoeing into the idea of congestion pricing. This may prove to be a heavier lift for LA than even New York City, but a congestion pricing study is being commissioned. Lastly, I'm just going to quickly touch on waste and water. LA is committed to becoming the largest city in America to achieve zero waste. The city wants to pass legislation to require all foodware from takeout restaurants be made with compostable material. Increase construction and demolition waste recycling requirements to 80%. The plan calls for all city streets to be made with 50% recycled asphalt, ban styrofoam citywide, and perhaps the biggest lift, but a crucial one, is putting in place the extended producer responsibility policies. This will need to be at the state level, so the plan just calls for LA to lead cities in advocating for it. Finally, on zero wasted water, because of the historic droughts the city has seen as of late, significant action has already been underway. In 2015, the city passed the most stringent water efficiency ordinance in any big city in the US. It required 20% reduction in indoor water use for new buildings and all redevelopments. During the 2017 Save the Drop campaign, city residents cut water consumption by 20%, showing that where there's a will, there's a way to be more efficient. The goal of recycling 100% of wasted water by 2035 received a major bump with the passage of Measure W. More than 50% of LA's water comes from somewhere else, and Measure W will help to capture 150,000 acre feet per year of stormwater by 2035. The goal is to build 200 multi-benefit stormwater capture projects by 2050. So scientists have repeatedly come back to tell us that they were wrong. They were wrong in that the pace and impacts of climate change are happening even faster than were originally predicted. You know, after heat waves, hurricanes, droughts, and fires just indiscriminately spread, the public's attention and thus politicians are tuned in and looking to act. So when you go back to your boss or clients with plans that need to make a business case for installing the latest high efficiency equipment or EV chargers or low flow toilets, you should point to California and New York not as singularities, but as the path others are and will follow. I had the opportunity to interview UN Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez for the podcast I produced, Political Climate. And as he said, we all need to make the case that green, sustainable growth is the only viable pathway for a secure and prosperous future for all. Climate action is good for the people, it's good for the planet, and if you're smart, it can also be good for business. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. We appreciate that. So that was Victoria Simon speaking on behalf of the West Coast. We are now going to pass on over to Leah Cairone speaking for the East Coast. So Leah, I am now switching presentation over to you.
Thanks so much. And let's see. Hopefully you can see that. Let me know if you can. Thank you, Sharon. Thanks, Catherine and Victoria. Hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to speak with you today about New York City's Climate Mobilization Act. And so the Climate Mobilization Act is a suite of local laws for past spring in New York City. Today, I'll focus on the most consequential and innovative of these laws, which is Local Law 97. We call it the Building Emissions Mandate, which places greenhouse gas intensity limits the city. I'll also discuss 3 other local laws that were passed as a part of the package briefly that will help the city to achieve our climate goals. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about the benefits that these laws will create for our city and beyond. We project that these laws will reduce 6 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. That's the equivalent of removing 1.3 million cars from the road each year. They'll also drive the creation of over 27,000 construction and operation jobs, and they'll prevent up to 130 deaths just in New York City from air quality improvements. So these requirements are going to create an enormous opportunity for businesses, for energy managers, for clean tech, but they're also going to help decarbonize our city and transform it into a healthier and safer place. So let's get into the details. First, quickly, as I mentioned, we have local laws 92 and 94 part of the package, and these will require that all new buildings and substantial renovations of any size building in New York City require them to install solar PV or green roofs or both on all available rooftop space starting at the end of this year. So this is also a big deal. This was passed as part of the package. We also passed Local Law 95, which will require large buildings to post energy letter grades on their facades starting in October of next year. So if you've spent time in New York, you've seen health grades on the fronts of restaurants, and this will be similar. The letter grades will be based on buildings' Energy Star scores, which is an energy efficiency metric. This shows New York City's buildings' Energy Star score performance today. The median level of performance is at about a 70, and so the way they work for buildings that need 100 Energy Star scores, those scoring from 70 to 84 will get a B, and those performing below the median will get a C or a D. So this law is meant to both inform New York City residents and tenants about their building's performance, and also to encourage building owners to do more energy efficiency to improve their grades. So New York City also passed a Property Access Clean Energy, or PACE, enabling legislation. Victoria mentioned PACE in her presentation. PACE is an innovative tool for building owners to finance energy efficiency and clean energy projects with funding terms and little to no money down up front. PACE is a great tool because the loan lives with the building and not the owner, and the debt service is typically sized to the projected energy savings. So the loan can be essentially flow neutral for the borrower. This is going to be really great for building owners that need to comply with the local laws under the Climate Mobilization Act, and we expect to have a PACE program up and lending by the end of this year. Now I will turn to Local Law 87, and I'll start by discussing the mechanics of the law so you can understand what's in it, and I'll end by talking a little bit about the implications for building owners and for energy professionals. So the law sets emission caps for buildings that are larger than 25,000 square feet beginning in 2024, which will cut carbon emissions at least 40% by 2030 and over 80% by 2050 building. So to put this in perspective, there are 50,000 buildings that will be subject to this law and over 1.5 billion square feet of built space affected. The law also requires the city's Department of Buildings to create a new office of Building Energy and Emissions Performance, which will implement and enforce the law. It requires the city to convene an advisory board to opine on outstanding technical questions and future emissions limits. Quite excitingly, it requires my team to study and develop a plan for a building carbon trading scheme, which could be overlaid on top of the law's requirements. And it also has some alternative compliance pathways built in, including for affordable housing and for city operations. And the way that greenhouse gas limits will work in practice is as follows. Starting in May of 2025, owners will have to report their emissions from the previous calendar year. This will be an annual and ongoing requirement. And the emissions limits will become more stringent in 2030. So in 2030, the limits will be aligned with our 40 by 30 goal, or reducing 40% by 2030. Beyond 2035, limits will be set through a rulemaking process. They're not made explicit in the law today. There is a ceiling for 2050 limits that is aligned with emissions reductions of at least 80%. Here we have a visualization of greenhouse gas intensity of large buildings in 2016, with the highest emissions intensity buildings on the left and the lowest emissions intensity buildings on the right. So greenhouse gas intensity, or GHGI, is expressed in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per square foot, sort of like an EOI that you might be more familiar with. The 2024 GHGI limits were set at the level of performance for each occupancy type. So in other words, continue to perform the way they do today. In 2024, 80% of the buildings will already be in compliance, and it's only the remaining 20% that actually need to make improvements in order to meet their targets. 2030, G at the level of performance of the lowest emitting 25th percentile. So here it's the reverse. Now, 5% of buildings that must make improvement to be able to achieve compliance come 2030. And the 20 is set very low. It's fairly rare that buildings are performing at this level today. We think it's really important that these targets are published and part of the law, so that the market has visibility and can make the right investment decisions today in order to future-proof buildings so that they can comply come 2030, 2040, 2050. So now I'll provide a quick example of how the calculations work in practice. Each property, in effect, will have their own emissions budget each year based on the occupancy classifications of the spaces within the property. A registered architect or engineer will have to calculate both the building's emissions budget and their actual emissions each year. And for emissions that exceed the budget, the penalty will be $268 per ton. And quickly, this is what the greenhouse gas intensity targets look like for different occupancy groups in the law. Here they're expressed in both tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per square foot and kilograms per square foot. In the law, they're expressed as tons per square foot. And so back to the example. For a building that's mixed use with 30,000 square feet of ground floor retail and 200,000 square feet of residential space, the building would apply the relevant greenhouse gas intensity limits for both retail and residential to the corresponding square footage, and that's how they come up with their annual emissions budget. In this example, their emissions budget would be 935 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2030. So if their budget for the year is 935 and their actual emissions for that year were 1,600, the building would be in excess by 695 tons and will be penalized at $268 per ton times the excess emissions of 695, and that would lead them to owe a penalty of $186,000 for that year. I'll mention that the penalty here in the law was sized to be comparable to the expected cost of compliance for buildings to do deep energy retrofits that achieve 2050 style targets, and so it should serve as an incentive for owners to do the necessary work to comply and not just pay the penalty. In some cases, they're quite steep. I'll also mention that the penalty, because of the way this calculus works, it scales with the size of the building and with the infraction in terms of greenhouse gas emissions above the limit. Finally, I just want to note that affordable housing and buildings with rent-regulated units do not need to comply with emissions limits, but instead they're required to undertake a list of prescriptive energy conservation measures. And these are fairly similar to retro-commissioning requirements, which you may be familiar with. So stepping back, how do owners actually comply with this law? Well, the good news is the city has a lot of data, tools, and support programs in place to help. Here we have a 3D map that was developed in partnership with New York University. It's publicly available and we can share it with you. It can show you the current performance of any large building in the city, along with its estimated future emissions target and its performance relative to similar buildings throughout the city. Through our New York City Accelerator program, we'll be doing individual outreach to buildings that need to do improvements to meet their future emissions limits and providing free technical assistance to help them out. Part of the assistance that we're able to offer to buildings who have done energy audits is a free deep energy retrofit plan, which is customized to each building. These plans show owners different retrofit package options that achieve deep energy and emissions reductions, and they also recommend sequencing interventions to take advantage of the useful life of equipment that's already in place. We were able to develop this planning tool thanks to major analysis that we undertook a few years back called the Technical Working Group report. This is also publicly available. I'm happy to point you to it. The Technical Working Group report analyzed the most common building typologies in New York City using lots of benchmarking and energy audit data that we've collected, and we modeled deep energy retrofit paths to understand the potential for improvements for those key typologies. So now I'll highlight the types of opportunities there are for buildings to improve their efficiency and also their emissions to comply with the mandates. So first, and maybe most obviously, where there's low-hanging fruit to improve existing HVAC and lighting systems, of course, there's an opportunity there. We want to make sure that all buildings, make sure that they have made these upgrades where possible. We also see a need for additional exterior insulation, for better windows, air sealing, perhaps in the passive house tradition, especially in the context of meeting very low emissions limits beyond 2030. Speaking of future-proofing our buildings, another thing that Victoria mentioned in her presentation, we know that ultimately we need to move away from fossil fuels to achieve our climate objectives. There is a major opportunity to scale the installation of heat pumps to electrify heat and hot water in our buildings to enable us to both get away from fossil fuel consumption and to enable the sourcing of clean renewable energy. And so this law should help to scale that technology where it's been limited to date. Owners will also be able to take advantage of on-site and local renewable energy generation to comply with the law. So there will be plenty of opportunities for installing technologies like solar and battery storage. And last but certainly not least, we know that in order to meet emissions targets year in and year out, operations and maintenance have to be a top priority, and more focused tenant engagement and coordination will also be necessary. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. These changes, these laws are very exciting for New York City, and we do hope that these types of climate policies will be scaled elsewhere in the country and also around the world. Thanks again to Victoria for sharing the great work that Los Angeles is doing, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you, Leah. So at this time, I am going to check the questions. We have a couple of questions in here. Nothing that's popped up just recently. Some of these have been in here just a little while, but the first one is, what is the future of solar panels, as the life of solar panels is estimated to be 25 years? And that is to any of you on the panel that would like to answer that.
This is Victoria. I mean, I think we've seen how the solar panels and the technology associated, the costs have been, I think, the biggest contributor to the program's expanding so dramatically. I mean, you don't even really need a lot of the incentives that go along with it to make them, a reasonable price, especially in places like California where it's so sunny. I think, the interesting area now seems to be more on the energy storage side because of the need to pair solar or wind, intermittent renewables with energy storage. So that's where I think a lot of the newer technology and focus has been on. We actually at our own house here just installed last week a power wall for battery use to go with our solar panels. And the payback is not very good right now for that, but we invested in it hoping to see some changes in the regulatory structure such that we'll eventually be able to use it to feed back into the grid and maximize the economics. But I think that's coming down the line too. So I think it's going to be really, you're seeing on a lot of different fronts a combination of technology evolution along with regulatory changes and incentive programs that go along with that.
Thank you, Victoria. Another question for you was, in the chart of the number of smoggy days in LA, one of our attendees noticed that there's been a recent spike since 2015, and was just asking, what would you attribute that to?
Actually, I think a lot of that actually has to do with the improving economy. I mentioned about how despite the fact that we're investing so much funding in public transportation, we're seeing an uptick in the number of people driving. And some of the studies that have come out trying to explain what's going on, especially when you have so many voters, overwhelmingly improve huge investments in public transportation. Why aren't people using it? Well, they're finding that the more money people have, the more likely they are to drive. And so the people in LA that are using public transportation are using it because they don't have another choice, which is not good. So, we need to keep investing in public transportation, but it is also making it more appealing to people to make that choice. So you're seeing a lot more people out on the roads. You should have to also look at these wildfires also contributed to the smog that happened. You had this terrible methane leak that occurred in Leso Canyon that was significant in terms of the pollution. So that was, more of a one-off event, but it is troubling to see the number kind of to tick back up.
Thank you, Victoria. Now, Leah, we have a couple of questions for you. The first one is, for the deep energy retrofit packages in New York City, was this prepared by a consultant? And if so, what type of consulting group completed the work? Have facility managers implemented any of these recommendations?
Yeah, sure. Great question. So the technical working group report was the result of a process called the technical working group. So we actually brought together a series of stakeholders across industries in the city. We had representatives from the engineering community, the architecture community, utilities, environmental organizations, environmental justice organizations, lots and lots of different people who came together to work on this report and to advise on the findings and the progress along the way. We did have a consultant, HDR, who supported the development of the report. The tool that I mentioned that's available now for building owners that come to seek out help from our programs, that was developed by a local sustainability and engineering firm, Stephen Winters. So yes, we've had consultant groups support us along the way, but this is much more importantly been a process that's included a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds throughout the city. We have certainly seen, we've had success with recruiting building owners that want to lead in this space to agree to participate in what we've until recently called the high performance retrofit track of one of our voluntary leadership programs. So we have, I don't have the exact numbers, but more than 30 major owners who have committed to phasing in these types of investments and doing really deep energy retrofits over the course of the next years, which is really exciting. So we just started partnering with buildings on that particular program, I want to say last year. So it's still in the initial phases, but really exciting opportunities there, and we're happy to have the partnership of owners throughout the city.
Thank you, Leah. There are a couple more questions for you, but just before we do that, I just want to point out that we are actually just past 3 o'clock right now. The original scheduled time for this webinar was 2 p.m. till 3 p.m. on the Eastern Coast. We will keep going until about 3:10 to just try and answer a few more questions, although we actually will wrap up questions in about 5 minutes because I then need to close up the webinar. But for those of you still listening, if you would like to remain online, please do so, and we will answer a few more questions. Those that don't get answered today, we will attempt to address following the webinar, perhaps via email. I will share your questions with the panel and we will get back to you. So please be patient with us. So time for maybe one, possibly two more questions. And this one is, let's see. Question again for Leah. It says, please, what software did you use for the GHG analysis?
So I'm not sure what GHG analysis the questioner is referencing. We've done a lot of our analysis in-house. When you're talking about the technical working group models, we use eQuest. So perhaps that's what the question is referencing.
Okay, thank you. And then another one for you, Leah. Is New York City working with utility companies to decarbonize electricity generation along with the goal of electrifying loads throughout the city?
Yes, absolutely. So we're excited to say that we actually just signed a contract with both of our major utilities on the electric and the natural gas side, so Con Edison and National Grid, to conduct a joint long-term decarbonization study to really, look at some of the work the city has already done, with our 80 by 50 roadmap and also our latest climate action plan to get to carbon neutrality. We're going to be working together to assess the costs of different options to decarbonize, what the sequencing and phasing should look like. And so, yes, we're very aware that it's going to be incredibly important to get the timing right, make sure that the electric grid is decarbonizing as quickly as possible so we can take advantage of things like electrification in our buildings. We know that electrifying heat and hot water is still a win today, even if the grid doesn't decarbonize because of the efficiencies inherent to the technology. But that said, yes, we're working together, and we're also very excited that the state has passed its own climate legislation, which is really groundbreaking and commits us to a zero carbon electric grid by 2040.
Great, thank you, Leah. Okay, so I'm just going to give a couple of reminders to all of our attendees today. So as you see on the screen right now, you have the email addresses for each of our three panelists today, Ms. Cairone Luthin, Leah Cairone, and Victoria Simon. If you still have questions, we're probably not going to get to them during this recorded session right now, but please go ahead and post them because I will download and share with our panelists the Q&A report. So just a few other things to bring your attention to. Victoria Simon is the policy consultant and the producer of the Political Climate podcast. So just here we go. This is how you can get to that podcast. So please feel free to take a look at that. Also, this is the information for the Retrofit Accelerator, as mentioned by Leah. For those of you who are not aware, and I'm sure that you already are, but have to take a moment to remind you, we have our AEE World Energy Conference and Expo coming up in DC in September. You can see the dates on the screen right there. We're at the Walter E. Washington Convention Center in DC. We hope that you can join us for that. And nicely following on from today's webinar, Ms. Cairone Luthin will be presenting as one of our conference presenters for Track L, the Emerging Energy Trends, and the session is named Energy Policy Innovation that Results in Effective Carbon Reduction. So we hope that you can join us for that. And our next AEE member webinar will be Wednesday, July 24th with Mr. Steve Cromer, who will be addressing solving the problem of quantifying efficiency. So we hope if you haven't already signed up for that, you will go ahead and do so. And on that note, I would like to say a huge thank you to our three panelists today, Miss Cairone Luthin, Miss Leah Cairone, and Miss Victoria Simon. We certainly appreciate your time and expertise today to share your knowledge with our AEE members here. Thank you to all of our attendees today. And just a quick reminder, we will be following this up with an email in the coming days. From GoToWebinar, you will receive a link to the recording plus a link to your certificate of attendance. So that's all from me. I just want to say if any of our panelists have any last comments or things that you would like to say, I'm passing over to you guys.
This is Cairone Luthin. So from the presentations that you heard from Victoria and from Leah, it's very clear that both cities would not have been able to get to where they are without the help of scientists and engineers. So I encourage all of you to get involved in the participation of development of regulatory policy that will impact the reduction of carbon change. They really can't do it without you.
Yeah, I agree, Catherine. This is Victoria, and thank you for making that point, because I think, you know, as we are following a lot of the details of what's going on in New York City, but also a lot of these plans are still up for being finalized, and that's where the, you know, engineers and people who are in the field really can be a major contributor to figuring out the details of how we actually achieve these incredibly ambitious goals. And I should also say, you know, related to the earlier question that was asked about the increasing smog, you know, you're seeing part of that is attributed to climate change because it's getting hotter, increasing the how smog is trapped and exacerbating it. And so I think you're seeing across the board that climate change is making a lot of these issues that we're facing even more challenging to address, whether that's, you know, needing more air conditioning because it's getting hotter, or having to, you know, build up more resiliency to deal with storms. So, you know, now really is the critical juncture that we need to make these big leaps forward, because it only gets harder from here. And so I really encourage you, all the listeners, to be part of the process, because we do need you.
And this is Leah. I don't have a whole lot to add. I completely agree with what both of you have said. The time really is now to do some of these, you know, to decarbonize the economy, basically. And it's going to be a major undertaking, but we're going to do it. And so, as was pointed out, I think, you know, we need all of you to be a part of this process, and hopefully you're able to take advantage of all of the great opportunities that are going to come from it. So thanks again for the opportunity to share with you all today.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar for today, but a huge thank you once again to our three presenters.